All right, good afternoon. I'm going to be covering nature versus nurture today. This is a kind of brief chapter. This is Unit 3C in your textbook. And this unit looks at the difference in nature, our genes versus our experiences and our interaction with our environment. So to begin with, we started looking at the nature side of the nature-nurture debate, which has a bigger impact on our behavior. Are we born predisposed to act the way we do, or do our experiences that we have throughout life shape our behavior and our thoughts? So looking at the nature side of this debate, we started with the genome. So the genome is the complete set of instructions that make up who you are. And we have to know all the different parts of the genome. So first of all, we looked at chromosomes. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You have 46 total. You get 23 from your mother and 23 from your father. The chromosomes are made up of that double helix molecule. Normally on the AP test, you'll see a question that either says 23 pairs or 46 total. So make sure you read it carefully and don't just pick the 23 because it could say 23 total. The DNA is usually associated with the double helix molecule. It makes up the chromosome. And this is where your genetic material is located. So there are small segments on the DNA molecule, and they are your genes. And we know we have certain genes that connect to physical traits. For example, you have genes for hair color, you have a gene for eye color, for your height, oily skin, dry skin, etc. But the question in psychology is, do we have certain genes that are connected to behavioral traits? So that's what we look at. So the genes are the small segments you can see in the diagram here on the chromosomes or the DNA molecule. There's another illustration. Here you can see the nucleus, which contains the chromosomes, which are made up of the DNA molecule. And then the small segments would be the genes. All right, the chemical components that hold the DNA molecule together or the chromosome together are referred to as nucleotides. And they're adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. We know that, and there's over 3 billion letters in the DNA sequence. Scientists have completely mapped out the nucleotide sequence. And according to some texts, that nucleotide sequence is 99.9% the same as every other human. But again, that depends on what text you see. Some will say 99.8, some say 99.5. However, pretty strong. There's a very slim percentage of the DNA molecule that makes us different. All right, there's often a comparison to books. So you may see a question that says a chromosome is to a book. And then what makes up a chromosome is the DNA molecule. What makes up a book? That would be pages. So the DNA molecule would be comparable to the page. And what are the small segments on the DNA molecule? That would be your genes. What are the small segments on a page? And that would be the words. And then a further breakdown, what make up the genes or the nucleotide sequence, or make up the genes or the DNA molecule? That would be the nucleotides. What makes up the words? That would be the letters. So make sure you know that comparison. Here's another diagram that you can see. So here's the nucleus inside of the cell. That's where the chromosomes are located. And you can see that the chromosomes are made up of the DNA molecule, and the small segments that you will see will be the genes. And What are the chemical compounds that hold that together? Here you see the nucleotides. All right, if there's any alteration in that nucleotide sequence, that would be referred to as a mutation. So this is a random error in the gene replication. So some may have an extra gene, some may be missing a gene. And we connect these mutations to different illnesses and different conditions or disorders. For example, some women carry the BRCA gene, and those who do have a strong likelihood or a strong percentage of developing breast cancer. And there's actual tests that you can find out if you carry that gene. There's a lot of genetic tests out there for all of these different genetic mutations. Some people carry a gene for colon cancer. And if they have that, there's a high probability that they will develop colon cancer. Like I said, there's a lot of genetic testing available to find out if you carry some of these. There's a lot of pros to genetic testing. If you take a genetic test, let's say with the BRCA gene, and you find out that you do have that gene, you can take preventative measures. You can have more mammograms. With the colon cancer, obviously you can have more screenings or colonoscopies. So you can prevent that. A lot of women will even opt to have a mastectomy if they carry the gene, and they want to make sure they don't have to worry about that. So those are some pros, but there's a lot of ethical issues. There are downsides. There are some of these genetic conditions that there are no cure for. We talked about Huntington's disease, which destroys the brain cells, the neurons in the brain over time. And there's usually a life expectancy, normally not beyond 50. I think today it's getting longer and longer, but that can lead to a lot of depression if you find out that you carry that. A lot of ethical issues involved as well. At one time, employers could actually see genetic tests that you had taken. So, they would give, or insurance companies, they would charge people higher premiums if they carried these certain genes, because they were afraid that they were going to eventually cost them a lot of money. And employers were firing individuals who carried these. So in 2008, the GINA Act was passed, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, so that you have to give consent if you want anybody to see your genetic testing. It's private and confidential now. All right, so that was everything. That's a really brief part of this unit on the genome. So the next thing we're going to look at is continuing with the nature-nurture side, and we're going to look at evolutionary psychology. So let me pull that up. So if you recall, evolutionary psychology is a branch in psychology that would state that a lot of our behaviors and thoughts that we have evolved in us over time, and we share them with a large portion of the population. And I gave you the example about, in every culture, men are more aggressive than females. And according to this perspective, it has been bred in us over time. You have to go back to like caveman times. Men were more aggressive. They had to go out and hunt to provide for their family. They had to fight off prey or other people from taking their things. Those who were successful and more aggressive and survived passed on those dominant genes. The weaker ones died off. So passing those on over time, we end up with an entire world population where males are more aggressive than females. So evolutionary psychology is based on the principle of natural selection. So that deals with reproduction and survival. So, for example, most of us are afraid of snakes. We're afraid of spiders. We're afraid of heights. And from this perspective, those have been bred in us over time. You go back to, again, to caveman times. Those who did not fear these things may get bitten by a poisonous snake or a poisonous spider, or fall off of a cliff or something high, and they would die off. The people who feared these things survived and passed on those genes of being fearful. So they have been bred in us over time. This particular branch of psychology was kind of sparked by Charles Darwin, who was a British biologist who looked at evolutionary changes in animals over time. For example, the giraffe. The giraffe did not always have a long neck, but a giraffe is not very aggressive. So giraffes that were really short and had short necks found it difficult to compete for food and vegetation from other animals who were more aggressive. So the giraffes with the longer necks were able to find more food that were higher than other animals, and they survived and passed on those genes. And then over thousands and thousands of years, you end up with a long-necked giraffe. Now, that's natural selection. We also looked at a case of artificial selection where somebody interferes with these changes. And we looked at an experiment that was done in Russia in the 1950s. This is Dmitry Belyaev, and he took some foxes, 40 males, 100 females, and he wanted to determine whether or not he could actually create a domestic fox, a tame fox, because most foxes are not tame. They're very wild. They won't come to you. So what he did was he mated them, and then from their offspring, he took the tamest of those, and then he bred those, and he kept repeating this process. And over 40 years, like, he would take the ones who would come to him and be more apt to let him, come near them. And over 40 years, he created a domestic fox that you could purchase as a pet. They started to bark like dogs, and they would respond if you called them by name. So you could actually get them and take them into your home. So that's artificial selection, where you're actually interfering with that evolutionary process. And there's the video that I showed you. All right, the next thing we looked at when we looked at evolutionary psychology was actually the preferences that we have for our mates. Evolutionary psychologists believe that a lot of the preferences that we have been bred in us over time. So let's look at those. They find in every culture worldwide, men prefer youthful. Just a minute. Sorry, I had people walking through the house. So they find that in every culture, men tend to prefer youthful women, a mate that's younger than them, more attractive physical features, women who have wider hips, because that indicates childbearing. And women, on the other hand, when surveyed, tend to prefer someone who's older, more mature, someone who could provide for them and have higher social status. And according to this perspective, again, that's been bred in us, because men should be attracted to younger women who look youthful and can reproduce. If men were attracted to older women who lose the ability to reproduce as we age, especially going through menopause, we would continue to cease as this. We would, what am I trying to say? We would cease to exist as a species. So women, that's been bred in us way back in caveman time. Men were the providers, and that's what we tend to look for in a mate today. So with that being said, psychologists thought, well, if men are all about youth and fertility and just hooking up to mate and not really looking for relationships and interaction in their mate, they would be more prone to casual hookups with a stranger. So, but women would not, because they're looking for relationships. They're not just looking for physical attraction to reproduce like men. So several different colleges, one in Dartmouth, England, and Florida State University here in the United States were two of them. They had individuals walk up to the opposite sex and say to them, just random people, hey, I find you attractive. Would you sleep with me tonight? And in both of those studies, and it's been replicated even more, they found that 75% of all men who were approached agreed to hook up that night, so 3 out of 4, whereas none of the women would agree. So I guess there is something to our preferences when it comes to the opposite sex or mating and evolutionary psychology. On the other hand, most women agreed to go to coffee when asked, but refused to hook up, where men were okay with sleeping with a stranger, but didn't want to go have coffee because that's not what's been bred in them relationships. They were always out on the hunt or away, having to provide for the family. All right, so that's all with evolutionary psychology. Continuing on with the nature side of the nature-nurture debate, we looked at the actual field that focuses on where we get our behaviors and our thoughts from. Is it in our genes, or does it come from our experiences? This is behavior genetics. And so somebody who studies this this controversy would be a behavior geneticist. So when looking at support for the nature side, they usually look at twin studies and adoption studies. All right, so what would be the ideal group of people to study, to investigate, which has a bigger influence on nature and nurture? Well, the ideal would be obviously twins, identical twins, because they have the same genetic makeup. But the best thing would be identical twins raised in separate homes. So we talked about the Minnesota study, twin study, that was conducted, and they found 100 and close to 150, 160 sets of identical twins that were separated at birth, and in many cases did not know they even had a twin. So all of these individuals were reunited with their twin after they were about 30 or 40. And they went through intense testing. They looked at, their habits. They looked at their IQ. They asked them all kinds of questions. And they found some really, really uncanny similarities between these identical twins raised in completely different homes. And I showed you those videos of a few of the twins. The Jim twins were very interesting. They had the same, their wives had the same name, their children had the same name, they had the same occupations, they had all of the same mannerisms and the same, almost exact same IQ. And they found this to be true with many of the cases. So this is a strong support for our behaviors coming from our genes. Since they have the same genes raised in different environments, got to be the genes. In addition, they looked at adoption studies. So they're looking at children who were adopted at birth. And then when they get older, they are testing them. And they're testing the biological parents, and then they're also testing their adoptive parents. And what they were finding was they had all of these same similarities with the biological parent as opposed to the parent who raised them, their adopted parent. So after looking at all of these, and I think I have That's the Jim twins there. After looking at the adoption and the twin studies, it was believed that these are the traits that we actually get from our genes. It doesn't come from our upbringing or experience. That our interests, our fears, and that goes back to evolutionary, they've kind of been bred in us. Our temperament. Temperament is how you react in an emotional situation, whether you're uptight or you're really laid back and easygoing. That tends to be constant. An obnoxious, overbearing little 3-year-old tends to be that way when they get older as well. They believe this is something that we inherit and stays pretty constant. IQ levels tend to be the same, when both of these studies. They believe that's something that's in our genes. And personality. When people have a certain personality, whether they're very extroverted or introverted or neurotic or stable, they tend to be that way throughout their entire life. All right, so those are the traits that are believed to be inherited. But what about nurturing then? How does our nurturing or our experience or our upbringing impact our behavior? And for that, we looked at a case of a few feral children. A feral child is a wild child, a child who has been pretty much raised in either isolation or in some cases raised by animals. And we find that even though these children may be born with all of their intellectual faculties, so they're born a normal child, without that interaction with others, without that touch, that interaction, and having any type of normal experience, they're not going to fully develop. So even though we might be born with a certain intelligence level, if you're never talked to, if you're never around other people, if you don't have any experience, your IQ level will never flourish to where it's supposed to be. You'll never develop the personality that was laid out for you in your genes. So nurturing and nature and nurture, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. We know specifically when we looked at Jeannie, there's a critical period for language. Unless you're spoken to or you learn to speak before you go through puberty, you won't be able to. That part of the brain, the Broca's areas, the Wernicke areas, specifically the Broca, will deteriorate and you lose that ability. Children who are actually found before reaching puberty tend to respond much better. They're able to be domesticated and able to speak, but don't fully recover the way a normal child would be had not been raised in isolation or among animals. So very sad. So environment is also important. And I said this before, they go hand in hand. Your genes lay down your foundation, but your experiences help you flourish, just like a seed. You put a seed in the ground, it's not going to fully develop unless it receives sunlight and water. And the same with humans. All right, so we're going to look at the other side of the nature nurture debate, and we're going to look at environmental, which I have to pull up, environmental influences. Okay, hold on. I don't have that one up here, so hold on. It didn't load all the way, so let me try again. All right, it's slowly starting up. There we go. All right, so when you looked at environmental influence, so an environmental influence is anything that is non-genetic. And a lot of our behaviors and our thoughts come from different environments and different experiences that we have. The first thing we looked at was the prenatal environment. We look more into that in the next chapter on, or we already talked about this, the lifespan. But things that we're exposed to in the womb can greatly affect our behavior and our thoughts as we age. It's important for an expecting mother to watch what they eat. They have to have proper nutrition. Watch what they drink. We know that alcohol, we know that caffeine can impair the development in the growing fetus. Cigarettes can lead to low birth weight, a cleft palate, cognitive abnormalities. Drinking can lead to physical and cognitive abnormalities. There are many teratogens, things that can cross over the placenta and harm the growing fetus. So the prenatal environment can impact us. That's the first environmental influence we're exposed to. There's also the infant experience. And I mentioned that touch and interaction isn't just something nice to have. It's something that's necessary. It's necessary for a baby to grow physically. Children who are not touched and interacted with on a daily basis do not grow as fast as other children. I talked about children in orphanages. They might have all their needs met, but they're not being touched all the time because staff are busy and they have a lot of children to attend to. So they were finding that children in an orphanage were not growing as fast physically as other peers their own age. So that's why we have foster care now. And I talked about my daughter, Morgan, when she was a preemie. She was in an incubator to stay warm because if they shiver, they're going to lose weight. And you don't want that. You want them to gain weight so they can go home. So they have me do touch therapy where you massage the skin every day. And children who this service was provided, they grew a lot faster than other children where maybe their parents couldn't come in and do that. The nurses were too short-staffed, so it was up to the parents to do that in the hospital where I was at. This touch and interaction also is necessary for cognitive development, neural development. Children who are not raised where they're having a lot of touch and interaction don't perform as well on cognitive tests as other children who have this necessity. It can also impair social development. So children who do not have this touch and interaction, that can interfere with their development later in life. It can lead to substance abuse, behavioral issues. So the infant experience and having that bonding, that interaction, that forming that attachment is absolutely necessary to develop fully. We talked about a condition where children are deprived of this touch and interaction and often have neglect. So we'll get to that in the next slide, but I did want to mention the diagram up here. When they look at rats who are raised in what they call an impoverished environment, so they're taken away and they're pretty much in isolation. So they're not receiving the touch and interaction from the mother. So in this case, we see that they do not grow to be as large as the other siblings raised with the mother. We find that they're impaired socially when they're allowed to go back and interact later on with other rats. They cannot do so. And also their cognitive development is limited. And you're like, well, how do you know if a rat has limited cognitive ability? Well, for most rats, if you put them in a maze, the first time they go through it, they'll stumble. But after they get through it, the next time you put them in, they can go through it right away. They've developed a cognitive map. They're really good at that. However, rats who are raised in this impoverished environment, every time you put them in the maze, it's like they just got put in there and they're learning it all over again. Okay, so back to reactive attachment disorder. So this is a disorder that affects children who have been neglected and deprived of touch, interaction, attachment, and in some cases, abuse is involved. And we looked at one of the first cases that kind of brought this to the public's attention. And this was based on a movie called Child of Rage. This woman in real life, her name is Beth, and she's probably about 10 years older than me. This was a Lifetime movie that came out in the 90s, I guess. So in the movie, they call her Kat, and I remember I showed you the video, but Beth, her parents were very, very abusive, and well, her mother ended up passing away because she kind of neglected Beth, and the father abused her as well. And after the mother died, the father would leave her and her younger brother. Beth was probably about 2.5 when she was removed from the home, and her younger brother, John, would have been around 9 months, I guess, or maybe close to a year. But the father would just leave them alone. They were completely neglected for days at a time. Social worker actually heard them crying, heard Beth crying inside of the home, or the mailman, sorry, heard Beth crying when he was delivering mail, contacted social services, and a social worker came in and found Beth tied to a table leg and had apparently been standing in the kitchen like that for days. And her younger brother was lying in a crib and had a bottle, of course, so old it had curdled and couldn't drink it. So they get placed in foster care, and the foster parents start noticing, they weren't ever told about the neglect and abuse. The foster parents start noticing that Beth has all these outbursts. It becomes very, very angry, throws things, screams, and it starts to hurt the family pet, hurts her younger brother, and it's just very cold. These children have no emotion, no empathy. They're very, very distant. They're manipulative. And so when they went to the social worker, they found out what had happened, and they took her for therapy. And she was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. So what happens is they've never learned to trust. They've been neglected, and they get very, very angry, and they go into this period of rage, and they cry as a baby. The need is not met, and they never learn how to trust. And it's very cyclical. And then when they get older, like I said, they start to be very, very angry and very disconnected. The therapist used what was called hug therapy to help treat Beth. They don't know how to interact because they've never been held. They've never been touched. That's what they've been deprived of. So in the hug therapy, whenever they would have these outbursts, the parents were to wrap their arms around them, just hug them to kind of expose them to feeling touch and interaction. And over time, that would allow them to accept being close to someone and having that interaction and attachment. And most children do recover. The younger the child is when the therapy is started, the more likely they are to recover from that. But today she actually is a nurse and has family of her own. So she fully recovered. That's the movie. Very, very good movie. So parents during your elementary school years have a big influence on your behavior as well. A lot of your habits come from your caregivers. And we talked about your values or your morals, your religion, your political preference, and your value of education, whether or not education is important or not. That comes from your upbringing. That comes from your caregivers. You're not born with a gene that says you're going to be Protestant or Catholic or Republican or Democrat. That is something that you get and is influenced by the people who raise you. So although your personality is something that's mostly in your genes and set in stone, your temperament, your intelligence, these are the things that are influenced by your caregivers. Now, when you get to be your age, during adolescence, parents can take a back seat. They're not the biggest influence in your life anymore. Peers become a very big influence. You want to try and fit in with others, and it's important to adolescents to fit in with groups and have certain peers, accept you and like you. So a lot of people adjust their behavior and start to engage in certain activities that their friend group also likes to do. The book talks a lot about some negative influences like smoking. Most people who start smoking, that usually begins during your adolescent or early adulthood, college years. And it usually comes from peer pressure, influence from peers. It's very rare that somebody who's 45, starts smoking. That usually comes during this time period. All right, the next influence would be culture. A lot of our behaviors that we have simply just come from the culture or the environment that we live in. So, for example, in our culture, we shake hands to greet. Other cultures, they bow or kiss. Excuse me. Our culture, we are very fast paced. So we have fast food. We're always on the go. Where other cultures, they go out to eat. It's a socialization. They sit and they relax and eat for hours and interact with others. We are such a fast paced society. We're always on the go. So we like that fast food. We drive on the right. So we walk on the right. If somebody comes towards you, you walk to the right. In cultures where somebody's driving where they drive on the left, they move to the left. So, all right. So some of our behaviors come from just where we live. We looked at social norms, which come from our society. So a social norm is a rule that's not written down anywhere. It's an accepted or expected behavior, but it's just unwritten. These unwritten rules we all follow. For example, you don't pass gas in public. You don't chew with your mouth open. You don't eat food out of the trash. You don't double dip a chip at a party. You don't talk really loud on a phone whenever you're in the movies and things like that. So these go along with our culture. These are behaviors that we have that just come from our society that you don't find anywhere. We just all tend to follow them. Under culture, also, we looked at memes. Memes, this is a different definition of memes, different than what you would hear today. But for AP Psych, meme is a self-replicating idea. This could be a fashion or fad passed on. Sometimes they continue, sometimes they fade. So different styles come and go. We looked at like poodle skirts, go-go boots, look at flared jeans, polyester throughout the years. Rubik's Cube was an example. They're back now, but they were very popular when I was in school in the 80s. Planking was a trend that occurred for a while. Glad that strange occurrence went away. We talked about the fact that all cultures, we have one thing in common. All cultures, people smile to show friendliness and happiness. So that's one similarity. Another similarity, all cultures, we like that buffer zone. We like that personal space. We don't want people getting up in our face. We don't like that close talker. So that's true for everyone. All right, the next environmental influence that we looked at was gender. So we know that our sex is determined by our genes, right? An XX, we get a female, an XY, we get a male. But how we act, our gender characteristics, come from our environment. Okay, so let's look at that. So the definition of gender, so we know our genes determine male or female, but our gender is actually influenced by our upbringing, by our experiences. Gender refers to characteristics by which we define males and females. So when you look at characteristics, we're talking about traits. So if I say masculine, if I say strong, if I say dominant, if I say aggressive, we tend to associate those traits with males. If I say sensitive, if I say passive, if I say emotional, sweet, we tend to connect those traits to females. And that is in general, okay? So in addition to that, different actions that we take as male or females are referred to as gender roles. So we're going to look at traditional gender roles. So at this part in class, I ask you who usually drives the car, who usually knows where to find anything to fix the car, to fix a flat tire, to repair anything that happens in the house, who cuts the lawn. Most of you would probably say your dad or the man in your home. And that's a traditional gender role. It's not always the case. That's just very common. So for females, they're the ones who cook, clean, take care of the kids, excuse me, buy birthday gifts, buy wedding gifts, things like that. Know where the thermometer would be. And that would be a traditional gender role. Not as strong as they used to be. After women's lib in the 1980s, they lessen and lessen over time. But before that, they're pretty diverse, pretty strong gender roles, traditional gender roles. So I showed you this chart back in the, 1960s. Okay, so this is before you had the push for women's equality in the 70s and 80s. So before that, if you asked married women, should be in the home, taking care of the house and taking care of the children, almost 45% of all females agree with that. And if you went back to the 50s, it would be much higher. Believe that women were better off in the home, men should go out and get a job. So like I said, after women's lib, that's going to continue to go down. This only goes up to 95, but it would be way down now. Many women work outside of the home. All right, so how do we develop our gender roles? How do we learn how to act masculine or feminine? So we looked at two different theories, and students often get these mixed up. But first of all, the social learning theory. This is being conditioned by your caregivers. So you're learning to act masculine or feminine through reward and punishment and imitation. So little boys start to emulate the behaviors of their father. Little girls act like their mothers. And like I said, reward and punishment play a role here. So for example, here you see Sammy. He goes out and plays baseball. He's imitating his dad and he's rewarded. He's patted on the back. He sees his mom put on makeup and he puts on makeup. He gets scolded for that. So, if you have a little boy who falls down on his bike, you say, get up, take it like a man. Boys aren't supposed to cry. Your little girl falls down and starts to cry. You just scoop her up and you encourage that emotional behavior. So oftentimes learning, what's masculine, what's feminine comes directly from the people who are raising you. And the second theory says that our gender roles and characteristics come from the media and from our society. So it's a cultural recipe. So if you ever watched, cartoons, specifically Disney, young children watch the damsel in distress princess for most of the Disney movies, who need some man to come along and help her in her hour of need. And the men are usually, very aggressive or rough and tough. And so young kids see this. Commercials are always, geared. Here's what little girls should play with. You see little girls with, the little play set, the baby dolls, the house, the easy bake ovens. You see little boys with the trucks and the tools and things like that. So at a very young age, kids are actually conditioned to see on TV and magazines and so forth what is masculine in the public eye and what is feminine. All right, so that was just the interview that I showed. They were asking children about male and female roles. So. All right, so that finishes everything for today. I didn't think it would take the full hour, so this is a very brief chapter. All right, so tomorrow night for our after-school review, I will be looking at, perception, and that probably won't take a full hour either. So, all right, you guys have a good night, and I will see you tomorrow.